Sarah Whitcombe rose to her feet in a courtroom packed with strangers who had no right to witness the worst moment of her life, and she screamed the words she had carried for 20 years. "You never served a day." Her voice cracked on the final word, echoing off walls that had heard 1,000 family tragedies, but perhaps never one quite like this. Her brother Daniel Reyes did not flinch. He sat perfectly still, his face unreadable, almost relieved, as if he had been waiting for this moment longer than anyone in that room could imagine. On the judge's desk sat a single sealed file, and only 3 people alive knew what was written inside it. By the time this case ended, the woman making the accusation would become the one standing accused. Before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. What you are about to hear is not a simple inheritance dispute. It is the story of a family torn apart by a promise nobody was allowed to break. A father who wrote one condition into his will that neither of his children fully understood, and a sealed military document that would decide who deserved $2.3 million and, more painfully, who deserved to be believed. 3 questions will follow you through every part of this story. Did Daniel really lie about his service to steal what was never his? What was actually hidden inside that file the judge refused to open until the final hearing? And why did Sarah wait 2 full decades before finally accusing her own brother in open court? To understand how 2 siblings ended up on opposite sides of a courtroom, you have to go back to a small house outside Asheville, North Carolina, where Daniel and Sarah Reyes grew up closer than most brothers and sisters ever managed to be. Their mother died when Sarah was only 7 years old, a sudden illness that swept through their household in a matter of weeks and left their father raising 2 children alone. In the years that followed, Daniel became something more than a brother. He walked her to school every morning without being asked. He sat outside her bedroom door during thunderstorms until she fell back asleep, never once complaining about the hours of sleep he lost doing it. Their father, Robert Reyes, was a proud and private man who rarely spoke about his own past, a man who built a modest trucking company from a single second-hand vehicle into a small fleet that supported the family for decades. He raised his children with a single unspoken rule that shaped everything they would later become. "Family protects family, no matter the cost," he would say, usually while fixing something around the house, rather than looking either child in the eye, as though the words embarrassed him, even as he believed them completely. Neither Daniel nor Sarah understood yet how heavy that rule would one day become, or how differently each of them would choose to carry it. Daniel and Sarah spent their childhood summers working alongside their father at the small trucking yard on the edge of town, loading crates, learning engine repair, listening to Robert tell half-finished stories about people he had known before their mother died, stories he always stopped short of completing. Sarah noticed the gaps more than Daniel did. She would ask follow-up questions their father never answered, developing early on the sharp, persistent curiosity that would eventually make her an excellent attorney, and later, the reason she could not let a 20-year-old silence rest. Daniel, by contrast, learned to accept incomplete stories as simply the way their family operated, a lesson that would define the rest of his life. As Daniel grew older, the lesson their father taught them took root in him differently than it did in Sarah, where she pursued law with sharp, competitive precision, graduating near the top of her class and building a reputation as an attorney who never backed down from a fight. Daniel felt pulled toward something larger than himself, something he struggled to explain even to the people closest to him. At 19, working late one night at the trucking yard, he told his father he wanted to enlist. Robert did not argue. He simply nodded, his eyes wet in a way Daniel had never seen before, and said only, "Then you'll understand the rest of what I've never told you." Sarah remembers the day Daniel left for basic training more clearly than she remembers most of her own adult life. She stood in the driveway of the house outside Asheville, arms crossed, refusing to cry in front of him, telling herself she was proud, when in truth she felt abandoned all over again, the same way she had felt when their mother died. Robert stood beside her, silent, his hand resting briefly on her shoulder, in the only gesture of comfort he seemed to know how to offer. Daniel hugged them both, promised he would write every week, and climbed into the car that would take him toward a life neither of them could picture, though only one of them would spend the next 2 decades resenting it. For the first 18 months, Daniel kept his promise faithfully. His letters arrived almost weekly, full of small, ordinary details, the kind that make distance bearable rather than unbearable. He wrote about the friends he made in his unit, the food he missed from home, the mountains that reminded him faintly of the Blue Ridge Hills surrounding Asheville, even though he was thousands of miles away. Sarah kept every letter in a shoebox under her bed, reading them so many times the folds began to soften and tear. Robert read them too, though he rarely commented beyond a quiet nod, as though each letter confirmed something he had long suspected about the kind of man his son was becoming. Then, without warning, the letters simply stopped. No explanation arrived. No notice came through official channels that Sarah or Robert could access. Weeks passed, then a month, then nearly 2, and Sarah began calling the number listed for Daniel's unit with increasing desperation, only to be told repeatedly that information about his current assignment was not available to family members at this time. She remembers the exact wording of that phrase, because she heard it so many times it eventually lost all meaning. Robert grew quieter during those weeks than Sarah had ever seen him, and though she assumed it was simple worry, she would not understand for another 20 years that her father already suspected exactly what had happened to his son. What Sarah did not know, and would not learn until the final hearing 2 decades later, was that somewhere overseas, Daniel had received a single phone call in the middle of the night that changed the entire direction of his service. He was pulled from his unit within 48 hours, transferred under a classification he was ordered never to discuss, not with his commanding officers back home, not with his father, and certainly not with his sister. He would later describe that phone call, in the only conversation he ever had about it with Marcus Bell, as the moment he stopped being a soldier, following orders, and became something closer to a guardian, bound to a promise he did not fully understand yet, but would spend the rest of his life honoring in silence. The reassignment placed Daniel in a small, isolated medical unit far from his original post, tasked with a responsibility no training had prepared him for. He was told only that a soldier from another unit had suffered catastrophic injuries during a mission gone wrong, and that his role would be to provide steady, constant presence during a recovery expected to take months rather than weeks. He was given strict instructions about confidentiality that felt, at the time, disproportionate to a simple hospital assignment. Instructions he would only fully understand much later. For 18 months, Daniel lived a version of service that existed entirely outside the letters he had once written home, a version he was forbidden from ever describing to the people who loved him most. When Daniel finally came home, something in him had changed in a way Sarah could not name, but could clearly feel every time they sat across the dinner table together. He was quieter, more watchful, prone to long silences that had not existed in him before he left. He avoided questions about his service with a practiced ease that unsettled her, redirecting every conversation with a skill that felt almost rehearsed. His discharge paperwork, when Sarah eventually saw fragments of it years later during a routine background check for a mortgage application, appeared incomplete, redacted in places that made no sense for an ordinary infantry assignment. She noticed the gaps immediately, the same way she had once noticed the gaps in her father's unfinished stories. Sarah asked Daniel directly, more than once over the following years, what had happened during those final 18 months overseas. Each time, his answer varied only slightly in wording, but never in substance. He would look at her with something between grief and tenderness, and say only, "You don't want this answer, Sarah. Trust me." It was, she would later admit, the first time in her life she felt her brother was choosing someone else's secret over her own peace of mind, and that feeling calcified over the years into something she mistook for betrayal, never once considering that the secret he carried might have nothing to do with guilt at all. Robert Reyes died 11 years later, following a slow decline that both his children traveled home to Asheville repeatedly to help manage. In his final months, he grew unusually insistent about updating his will, working closely with a local attorney named Harold Preston to include language his own children found strange at the time. He refused to explain the reasoning behind it, telling only Harold that the clause would make sense eventually, to whichever child was patient enough to wait for the truth. Sarah assumed, in the exhaustion of caregiving and grief, that her father's insistence was simply the confusion common to the dying. She would not understand until years later exactly how deliberate his final decision truly was. It was only after Robert's funeral, once the initial grief settled into something colder and more procedural, that the real fracture in the family became impossible to ignore. His will contained one unusual clause: the family trust, worth over $2 million, would pass to the child who served, a phrase the attorneys initially assumed referred simply to military service, since only Daniel had ever worn a uniform. Sarah, still carrying a decade of unanswered questions about her brother's mysterious discharge, saw in that clause not injustice, but opportunity, a legal pathway to finally force the truth she had been denied for so long into the open, whether Daniel wanted to give it to her or not. She hired an aggressive young attorney named Patricia Lynn, recommended by a colleague for her relentless approach to contested estates, and together they filed a formal challenge arguing that Daniel's service record had been falsified, incomplete, or worse, entirely fabricated to satisfy their father's condition. Sarah told herself repeatedly during those first weeks that the lawsuit was about fairness, about protecting an estate their father had worked his entire life to build. But beneath that justification sat something rawer and far older, a wound from a driveway goodbye 2 decades earlier that had never properly healed, disguised now in the language of legal procedure and sworn affidavits. The case became public faster than either sibling expected, largely because Patricia Lynn understood the value of public pressure in a contested estate dispute and was not shy about speaking to reporters outside the courthouse after preliminary hearings. Local news outlets picked up the phrase, "disgraced veteran, accused of inheritance fraud," running the story alongside grainy photographs of Daniel, taken years earlier at a company holiday party, images that made him look colder and more distant than he had ever been in person. Within weeks, strangers online were forming opinions about a man they had never met, based on redacted paperwork they did not understand, filling in the blanks of his silence with the worst possible version of events. Daniel's employer, a regional logistics company where he had worked steadily for over a decade, placed him on administrative leave pending the outcome of the case, citing concerns about reputational risk that had nothing to do with his actual job performance. Old friends stopped calling, uncertain how to navigate a controversy playing out in local headlines. Neighbors who had known Daniel for years began crossing the street rather than offer the usual friendly greeting, uncomfortable with the accusations swirling around him, even though none of them had any actual evidence beyond what they read online. Through it all, Daniel said almost nothing in his own defense, a silence the public interpreted as guilt, but that his sister, somewhere beneath her anger, recognized as something closer to exhaustion. Patricia Lynn built her case around 2 pieces of evidence that seemed devastating at first glance, and gave the lawsuit the momentum it needed to survive early motions to dismiss. The first was a line in Daniel's partially released discharge file, suggesting an irregular separation from active duty, the kind of language typically associated with disciplinary action rather than honorable service, though Patricia carefully avoided mentioning that irregular separations could also indicate classified reassignments, a distinction that would have undermined her entire argument. The second was a signature on a supplemental form that a hired document examiner testified did not match Daniel's known handwriting, raising the possibility of forgery somewhere in his record, a finding Patricia presented to the court with visible satisfaction. Sarah watched these revelations mount with a strange, hollow satisfaction she was reluctant to examine too closely, as though proving her brother a liar might finally explain the silence that had stood between them since the night his letters stopped arriving without warning so many years before. She told herself the lawsuit was never personal, that she simply wanted the truth documented and made official. But late at night, alone in her apartment, she found herself replaying that driveway goodbye over and over, searching for the exact moment she had lost her brother to a version of himself she no longer recognized or understood. Behind closed doors, Daniel's defense attorney, a methodical and quietly determined man named Marcus Bell, petitioned the Department of Defense twice for a limited unsealing of Daniel's full service record, hoping a narrow disclosure might clear his client without exposing everything the file contained. Both requests were denied without explanation, a response Marcus had come to expect from classified reassignments of that particular era, though the denials frustrated him precisely because he had no way to explain to the court why his client refused to simply defend himself with the truth. He watched Daniel absorb each denial without complaint, without frustration, almost as if his client welcomed the possibility of losing the case rather than the alternative, which was having someone else's private tragedy forced into public record before its time. Marcus spent months building what limited defense he could construct from unclassified material, interviewing former colleagues who remembered Daniel as reliable and steady, gathering character references from his employer before the leave began, and documenting the financial contributions Daniel had quietly made toward his father's medical care in his final years, contributions Sarah herself had never fully tallied. None of it addressed the central accusation directly, and Marcus knew it, but he hoped it might be enough to establish reasonable doubt about the fraud allegation, even without access to the one document that could settle the matter definitively, sitting classified and untouched in a government archive neither attorney could reach. There is a quiet scene that few people outside the family ever witnessed, one Marcus Bell only learned about secondhand from a cemetery groundskeeper who mentioned it in passing during an unrelated conversation. On the anniversary of his father's death, Daniel drove alone to the small cemetery outside Asheville and sat beside the grave for nearly an hour without speaking to anyone who might have been watching. He later told Marcus it was the only place he still felt permission to say out loud what he had promised never to say anywhere else, a kind of confession delivered to a headstone rather than a living person, the closest thing to honesty he allowed himself during those difficult months of public scrutiny and private grief. Whatever words passed between Daniel and his father's headstone that afternoon, he carried them back into the courtroom the following week with a stillness that unsettled even his own legal team, a calm that looked, to anyone watching closely, less like guilt and more like a man finally ready to stop carrying something alone, though nobody in that courtroom yet understood what exactly he was preparing to release. Marcus noticed the shift immediately and asked his client directly whether something had changed. Daniel only replied that he had made a decision about how the case would end, though he refused to elaborate further, leaving even his own attorney to face the final hearing without knowing what his client actually intended. The final hearing arrived on a gray Tuesday morning, the courtroom fuller than it had been at any point in the case, drawn by months of headlines promising a dramatic conclusion to a story that had captivated the small community around Asheville for the better part of a year. Reporters lined the back rows with notepads ready. Neighbors who had once crossed the street to avoid Daniel now sat eagerly in the gallery, hoping to witness whatever verdict finally emerged. Sarah sat rigid beside Patricia Lynn, rehearsing in her mind the accusation she had waited 20 years to say aloud, while Daniel sat across the aisle beside Marcus Bell, his hands folded, his expression unreadable, in a way that had become almost familiar to everyone who had followed the case. Judge Eleanor Voss entered carrying a single sealed folder that had, until the previous evening, remained locked under a classification neither attorney had been permitted to access, delivered to her chambers by courier under conditions so unusual that even the court clerk commented on it privately to colleagues. She placed the folder on her desk without opening it, addressing both attorneys briefly to confirm that closing statements would proceed as scheduled before she reviewed its contents in full. The entire room seemed to hold its breath at once, sensing, without quite understanding why, that whatever the folder contained would decide far more than the $2.3 million at the center of the dispute. Patricia Lynn delivered her closing argument first, methodical and confident, walking the court through every piece of evidence she had assembled over the preceding months, from the irregular discharge language, to the disputed signature, to the years of silence Daniel had offered in place of an actual defense. She reminded the judge that silence, in a civil proceeding, could reasonably be interpreted as an inability to refute the claims being made against him. Sarah watched her attorney's presentation with a tight, controlled expression, unaware that within the hour, every carefully constructed argument in that closing statement would be rendered irrelevant by 4 words she had not yet heard. Marcus Bell rose next, offering a shorter, more restrained closing than anyone in the courtroom expected from a case that had generated so much public attention. He reminded the judge that redacted records and disputed signatures did not, on their own, constitute proof of fraud, and that his client's silence reflected discipline rather than guilt, though he acknowledged he could not fully explain that discipline without access to information the court itself did not yet possess. He sat down without theatrics, and for a moment, the courtroom seemed almost disappointed by the lack of drama, unaware that the case's true climax had not yet begun. Sarah's closing statement began calmly, but by the 3rd sentence her composure cracked entirely, 20 years of grief, resentment, and unanswered letters pouring out of her at once, in a way that surprised even Patricia Lynn, who had prepared her client for measured testimony rather than raw emotion. Sarah spoke of the driveway goodbye, the silence that followed his return, the redacted paperwork, the years of feeling like a stranger to her own brother, culminating in the accusation that had defined the entire trial. "You never served a day," she screamed, rising from her chair, her voice breaking in front of everyone who had come to watch a story they thought they already understood. Daniel did not raise his voice in response. He did not defend himself, did not object, did not even glance toward Marcus for guidance. He simply looked at his sister with an expression that held no anger at all, only something that looked almost like relief, as though the moment he had spent 2 decades preparing for and dreading in equal measure had finally, mercifully, arrived. Judge Voss allowed the outburst to settle without interruption, watching both siblings with the careful attention of someone who had long ago learned that the most important testimony in any family dispute rarely arrives through prepared statements. Judge Voss allowed the silence to settle before she spoke, opening the sealed file slowly, scanning its contents for what felt to the courtroom like an unbearable length of time. Reporters in the back row stopped writing. Sarah gripped the edge of the table in front of her. Then Judge Voss looked up, first at Daniel, then at Sarah, and delivered 4 words that would unravel everything the courtroom believed it understood about the case they had followed for nearly a year. He served under her. The phrase made no immediate sense to anyone present, least of all Sarah, whose face shifted from fury to confusion in the span of a single breath. Judge Voss continued reading aloud, revealing that Daniel's classified reassignment 2 decades earlier had not been disciplinary at all, but deeply, quietly personal, in a way no one in that courtroom had anticipated. The file explained that during his deployment, Daniel had been reassigned to provide direct, unofficial support to a critically wounded soldier whose recovery required round-the-clock supervision outside standard medical channels. A soldier who had survived a mission, gone catastrophically wrong, and needed someone he trusted completely by his side through the long, uncertain months that followed. Someone the military determined Daniel was uniquely suited to become, based on his steady temperament and unusual patience under pressure. That soldier's name, Judge Voss read aloud, was Thomas Whitcombe, the man Sarah would meet years later at a mutual friend's wedding, fall in love with, and eventually marry, entirely unaware that her own brother had once sat beside his hospital bed through the worst nights of his life, years before she ever learned his name. Thomas had begged Daniel, before ever meeting Sarah, to keep the severity of his collapse and slow recovery private, terrified it would define him for the rest of his life among people who had only ever known him as strong and capable. Daniel agreed to that request without hesitation, not knowing then that the promise would eventually cost him his own sister's trust decades later. Judge Voss explained that Thomas Whitcombe had asked for one additional condition before his death several years earlier, a condition Daniel honored without ever telling Sarah the reason behind his prolonged silence on the matter. Thomas did not want his wife to know how close she had come to loving a man who nearly did not survive to meet her, believing the knowledge would only burden her with a grief that served no practical purpose beyond causing her pain. Daniel carried that secret through every accusation, every headline, every year of his sister's growing resentment, choosing a dead friend's peace of mind over his own reputation, and ultimately, over the relationship he valued more than the inheritance, now sitting untouched on the judge's desk in front of him. The courtroom sat in near total silence as Judge Voss finished reading the remaining details of the file, including the classified commendation Daniel had quietly received for his service to Thomas Whitcombe, a commendation he had never once mentioned to anyone in his family, filed away and forgotten by everyone except the small circle of officials who had processed it decades earlier. Sarah did not speak for nearly a full minute after the judge finished, the anger that had carried her through 20 years collapsing into something far heavier, a grief she had never allowed herself to feel because she had spent so long directing it at the wrong person entirely, mistaking her brother's silence for betrayal instead of recognizing it as sacrifice. She turned to look at her brother, searching his face for the resentment she had expected to find there after everything she had just screamed at him in front of a packed courtroom and, until recently, a hostile local press. She found none. Daniel only nodded once, the same quiet nod their father had given him the day he left for basic training outside their childhood home in Asheville, as though some circles in a family only close when the truth finally catches up to the silence that created them in the first place, a silence that had cost them both more than either of them had ever fully admitted to themselves. Judge Voss addressed the courtroom directly before adjourning, noting that the trust's original language, the child who served, had never specified military service exclusively, despite the assumption everyone involved in the case had made from the very beginning. Robert Reyes, in his own handwritten notes attached to the will, filed carefully by his attorney Harold Preston years earlier, had described service as something broader, a willingness to protect the family even at tremendous personal cost. By that measure, the judge ruled, Daniel had fulfilled his father's condition twice over, first through his military record, and second through 2 decades of silence he maintained purely to protect his sister from a grief she never needed to carry. The inheritance was legally his, the judge confirmed, though by the time the ruling was formally read into the record, Neither sibling seemed to care about the money at all, both of them still absorbing the weight of everything that had just been revealed, in front of strangers who had spent months forming opinions about a story none of them had actually understood. Reporters in the back row scrambled to update notes that would need to be rewritten entirely for the next day's headlines, the narrative of a disgraced veteran, now replaced by something far more complicated and far less satisfying to summarize in a single sentence. Outside the courthouse that afternoon, as the crowd slowly dispersed and cameras finally stopped following them, Sarah found an envelope Marcus Bell had been holding for her since before the trial even began, a letter their father had written years earlier and asked to be delivered only if the truth ever became legally necessary to reveal. In it, Robert Reyes explained that he had learned of Thomas's condition long before Sarah ever did, sworn to the same silence Daniel carried, and had written the trust's unusual clause, specifically hoping his children would one day understand that service takes many forms, beyond the ones most easily recognized or rewarded. Robert's letter continued for several pages, describing conversations he had shared privately with Daniel over the years, conversations Sarah had never known about, in which father and son discussed the weight of the promise Daniel carried, and whether it was worth the cost it was clearly exacting on his relationship with his sister. Robert wrote that he had urged Daniel more than once to consider telling Sarah the truth, and that Daniel had refused each time, insisting that a promise made to a dying friend meant more than any misunderstanding it might cause within his own family, a conviction Robert admitted he came to respect, even as it broke his heart to watch his children grow apart because of it. He asked Sarah, in his final written words to her, not to let anger outlive the people capable of forgiving it, a phrase she would later admit changed something fundamental in how she understood the entire ordeal. Sarah read the letter twice, standing on the courthouse steps, tears finally breaking through the composure she had maintained throughout the trial, and when she looked up, Daniel was still standing nearby, not approaching, simply waiting, the same patient stillness he had carried through every accusation leveled against him over the preceding months, giving her the space to arrive at forgiveness on her own timeline rather than his. In the weeks that followed, Daniel quietly split the inheritance with his sister without being asked to, the same instinct that had guided every choice he made since that first classified phone call 2 decades earlier had reshaped the entire course of his life. He never once mentioned the accusation she had screamed at him in open court, never asked for an apology, and never explained in detail why he had chosen silence over vindication for so long, even when doing so would have spared him a year of public humiliation and professional consequence that followed him well after the case officially concluded. When Sarah finally asked him directly how he had carried that secret for 20 years without breaking, without once letting slip even a fragment of the truth during their most painful arguments, Daniel answered the way their father once had, standing in that same driveway outside the house in Asheville where their story had truly begun decades earlier. "Family protects family," he said, "even when it costs you everything people think you owe them in return." Sarah did not respond immediately, but she reached out and took his hand, the first time she had done so since the night his letters stopped arriving without warning, so many years before. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes from being misunderstood by the people who love you most, and Daniel Reyes lived inside that loneliness for 2 decades, rather than break a promise made to a dying friend who had trusted him with the most vulnerable chapter of his life. His silence was never a confession of guilt, but the courtroom, the headlines, and even his own sister spent years reading it that way, because silence is so often mistaken for something it is not, filled in by observers with whatever story feels easiest to believe, rather than the harder, quieter truth actually sitting underneath it. What finally broke that misunderstanding was not a confrontation, not even the lawsuit Sarah had spent months building against her own brother, but a sealed file, 4 words, and a willingness on Judge Voss's part to let the truth speak for itself Instead of allowing assumption to finish a story it never had the right to tell in the first place. In the months following the trial, Sarah and Daniel slowly rebuilt what the previous 2 decades had quietly eroded, meeting for dinner at their father's old trucking yard, now converted into a small community garden Daniel maintained in his spare time. A place that felt, for the first time in years, like it genuinely belonged to both of them again. Would you have stayed silent for 20 years to protect someone you loved, even if it meant losing your own sister's trust in the process? Some promises are heavier than any accusation, and some forms of loyalty look, from the outside, indistinguishable from guilt, a distinction that only becomes visible once someone finally has the courage or the permission to explain it. Daniel Reyes chose silence, not because he had something to hide, but because he had someone to protect. And in the end, that choice cost him more than the courtroom ever could have, though it ultimately gave him back the one relationship he had spent 20 years quietly, painfully afraid he had already lost. Let us know in the comments what you would have done in Daniel's place, and whether you believe silence like his deserves to be called loyalty or something else entirely. If this story moved you, stay close, because the next family secret we uncover is even harder to believe than this one, and it begins with a mother who vanished for 11 days and returned with a confession nobody in her family was prepared to hear.